Welcome to the podcast Kroc Enrolled. My name is Kroc Lan. Today's guest is Professor Atalia Omer from the University of Notre Dame. Thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this space.
I want to ask the question about this Esther Project because some of the audience may not know something about it. Can you tell us what is the project and why this is not helpful for Jewish people?
Thank you for this question. It's an especially appropriate question since we are recording this session at the eve of the holiday of Purim, which marks the story of Esther. This is when Jewish people read the story of Esther and how she basically saved the Jews of Persia from death and destruction. This is the narrative. And Project Esther, however, refers to basically an addendum to Project 2025. That is the strategy, the blueprint for this second Trump administration, designed to destroy any kind of wins for progressive politics, LGBTQI rights, and of course, all the gains of the movement against racism in the United States and also their economic ramifications. But what is interesting is that Project Esther was published on the anniversary day of October 7th, 2023. So Project Esther was published from the same place, the Heritage Foundation that drafted Project 2025, on the anniversary of the Hamas attack on the southern communities in Israel, which then initiated the genocidal response of Israel against the people of Gaza and the infrastructure of life in Gaza. And so Project Esther was published exactly on the 1-year anniversary on October 7th, 2024. And what is interesting and deeply troubling about Project Esther is that whereas Project 2025 did not have any kind of engagement with the fight against anti-Semitism, you see how Project Esther capitalize on the fight against anti-Semitism. Really, it's the weaponization of anti-Semitism. There is a long history of the weaponization of anti-Semitism that was promoted by various Zionist organizations, Jewish and Christian. And so all of a sudden, there is a centering of the fight against anti-Semitism. But if you read Project Esther carefully, you see that under this premise that somehow this is a framework or a strategy to make Jews safe, there is a lot of a discourse, a discussion about Jewish safety. In fact, it really uses the fight against anti-Semitism. So this is the weaponization of anti-Semitism in order to mount an assault, really an overwhelming assault against DEI initiatives, against diversity, equation, and inclusion initiatives, against wokeness culture. It's the LGBTQI plus communities. And really you see how the discourse of anti-Semitism is used as a weapon, as an opportunistic weapon to promote a very aggressive agenda, white supremacist agenda. Another dimension that is deeply troubling about Project Esther, again, is that how the cultural appropriation of the story of Esther, the document Project Esther was drafted by Christian nationalists. You don't have their engagement with Jewish people. This is a form of appropriation of a Jewish story. And also the drafters of the document basically talk about Jewish people and Jewish organizations, and they explicitly engage with Jewish Voice for Peace, but also with Bernie Sanders, for instance, that somehow those Jewish organizations and individuals and political actors are somehow gullible actors, enablers of a kind of a Hamas network. So you see the logic of anti-Semitism that engages in this narrative, like conspiracy narratives about a cabal that controls everything. But what in the document, in very explicit ways, is how it activates Islamophobia and really projects onto this discourse that is deeply wrong of Hamas cabal that activates through a variety of organizations that appear to be civil organizations. And then the document makes all this Hamas network a form of anti-Americanism. So under the guise of fighting anti-Semitism, you see a conflation of Jews with Israel, with a political, settler colonial, and now genocidal project. You see the conflation of Jews with this project, with Israel, so Jews equal Israel, and then somehow you see a conflation of Israel with Americanism. And I'll conclude by saying that this kind of imposition, this conspiracy logic that talks about this Hamas network, really shows the scaffolding that has been put in place and really consolidated in the course of the war on terrorism. So you have the counterterrorism legal framework and various methodologies of interrogating people or rendering people as terrorists. And you see the convergence of this with the equally extensive infrastructure of the anti-Semitism discourse. For now many years, you have mechanisms in place that try to litigate criticism of Israel as if it was anti-Semitic, different mechanisms of lawfare, rendering, again, this conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. And now, as a result of October 7th and the atmosphere that generated on especially American campuses, but in a broader kind of the public discourse around that and during the genocide in Gaza, all of a sudden you had a moment of opportunity, like what Naomi Klein would talk about, disaster capitalism. So you see how, in that context, the activation of Islamophobia, the activation of the weaponized form of anti-Semitism. There is real anti-Semitism, but what we see is a long legacy and infrastructure in place that has already weaponized anti-Semitism, and now you see it accelerating and also connecting with the war on terror methodologies. So all of a sudden, if people are in that pro-Palestine space, they're not only in violation of Title VI or questions around discrimination, or they're not only rendered anti-Semitic, they are also rendered terrorist. And that mobilizes a whole different kind of legal mechanisms and legal implications, including deportation, loss of green card, and loss of funding. And all of this is really articulated very explicitly in Project Esther. And like Project 2025 that we see with seconds after the inauguration of Trump for his second term, immediately he followed up on what basically is articulated in Project 2025. The same also goes with Project Esther, and they go hand in hand. With Project Esther offering a very explicit way of really providing, in a sense, a shield to white supremacist policies, by framing them as if it's about Jewish safety, which of course it puts Jews, as like everybody else, in danger.
You have spoken out very publicly against some of the policies of Israel and against the war on Gaza. Can you give some of the reasons why you have done so?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about this. It was very clear to me the first day from October 7th, which of course shocked me, but also it did not shock me, it did not surprise me, because I had a very deep understanding of the context, of the realities on the ground, although it's been a very long time since I visited Gaza, but I had a very clear and intricate understanding of the realities there, and also in the West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem. I also was not shocked because I was very aware of the fact of the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, that it wasn't just an event that happened from 47 to 49, but it actually also predated the depopulation of Palestinians, predated the Nakba, or what in the Israeli and Zionist narrative is called the War of Independence. It's predated, it goes back, the story, the way I teach it in my classes, I start the story in late 19th century, and especially I focus on the Balfour Declaration, when a British lord promised the land of Palestine for Jews from Europe. So I had a very clear and intimate sense of the long history of Palestinian depopulation, displacement, domination through an analysis of the military occupation, the fragmentation of Palestinian geographies, the fact that Gaza was under blockade for 16 years before October 7. So I came with a very deep understanding of the context, and it shocked me and also even touched me personally, because I knew some of the people who were killed on October 7th. I immediately was so aware of the fact that Israel will respond in extreme forms of violence, and that it will be so much more destructive than ever before. But if you have an understanding of the history, including of the history of cyclical escalation against the Gaza Strip, that the level of destruction was going to be massive. And almost instantly, I used the word genocide to describe what is unfolding in Gaza, on the basis of the fact that I'm on a regular basis very attuned to Israeli media and to the broader kind of public discourse about how to respond to October 7th. So it was very clear to me that I needed to say something, that this is not the time to be quiet and a coward. And over the years, I've developed really deep friendships with Palestinian colleagues. I'm so indebted to both the friendships, the actual relationships with Palestinians that I've developed over the years, but also with the Palestinian scholarship that has deepened my understanding of how to understand Palestine Israel. And the deeper I went into this intellectual and personal journey, the more it became clear to me over the years, the key kind of framing for the reality on the ground in the past century plus history of the contemporary moment is the frame of settler colonialism. This is not to say that there are not other lenses that we can bring into the analysis, including nationalism, including various other kind of analytic frames to understand what has unfolded. But when you bring the frame of settler colonialism, it illuminates certain things, and especially if you look at just at the very basic map over a century and the demographic realities on the land and how they shifted over time. And that is not natural shifts. It's a result of particular policies and particular forms of violence. And the logic of settler colonialism is very easy. It's how to maximize land and minimize indigenous people on this land. And if you go to Palestine, Israel, you see those realities really unfold over time. And then at the moment of October 7th, that became once again a moment of opportunity, of ethnic cleansing. And of course, you have all eyes were focused for many months on a genocide that has been live streamed for everyone in the world to see. I was also very attuned to the realities in the West Bank of ethnic cleansing, that for many years, this is what Palestinians call the ongoing Nakba. You saw a gradual process of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem, of moving indigenous Palestinian people out, concentrating them more and more in various Bantustans. This is where Palestinians talk about fragmentation as the upshot of these many years of Nakba, of occupation, and also enabled by this peace process that was going on for 30 years, but only entrenched the occupation, only entrenched the fragmentation of Palestinian communities into different categories, segregating the Gaza Strip from the rest of Palestine, but it is a part of Palestine. For many years, I observed, like many others, the gradual ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, in particular, because this is the key space for the settlement project, for the colonization project, enabled by the Israeli government and the American government and other actors that are enablers. Now we are in a moment where we have on the table, in this current Trump administration, very explicit discourse of ethnic cleansing from Gaza. We are talking about, President Trump talks about ethnically cleansing 2 million people. And what is absolutely astonishing is that, according to polls of the Israeli public, about 80% of them is in support of this. And what is astonishing is that people talk about, in terms of the practicality of how to make it happen, the ethnic cleansing of 2 million people, as opposed to talking about on the level of ethics, that it's wrong. And so I've been following this for a long time. To begin with, I saw myself, I was incubated just in terms of my own autobiography in the Israeli peace movement, but my own learning over the years has deepened, primarily because of my relationship, intellectual and personal, with Palestinian scholars, and also with really thinking about the particularity of the case comparatively. And this is a very important process as well, that part of what the comparative work does, for instance, looking at bringing the frame of settler colonialism, as I mentioned before, is it de-exceptionalizes the case. And it may be personally difficult for someone to disengage from a sense of innocence, but the analytic comparative work can help in that process as well. And that has been also my journey. It's been illuminating. And at the moment, especially kind of the question asked me to reflect on the current moment of why I'm critical, why I'm outspoken, is that it was very clear to me that, as I said, after October 7th, that I couldn't be a coward. I needed to speak up. that was not the moment to be quiet and to be silent about it, whatever the cost is. And I've suffered consequences for that. But I also want to be able to look at myself in the mirror, and I also feel very strong responsibility to my students, to my Palestinian friends, to show up for them and to be in solidarity, and also understand that their struggle is entangled with my struggle, and my safety, my liberation cannot happen without their liberation.
There are Jewish groups in the United States who have spoken out, demonstrated in the Capitol. Can you share with us a little bit about these groups, or there are similar groups in Israel that are fighting for Palestinian rights?
I've documented and for many years and been immersed in those spaces for many years. And of course, after October 7th, almost immediately you saw really massive mobilization of American Jews who showed up and called for ceasefire and said, don't weaponize my pain, never again to anyone, which is, of course, reference to the fact that how the story of the Holocaust, the genocide against the Jews, is used basically to justify genocide. So American Jews came out in massive protest in order to say, don't do it in my name. It's not happening for my safety. And of course, they also showed up not only as Jews who want to challenge a particular narrative of Jewish history and Jewish meaning, but also they showed up as Americans, because as Americans, it's our tax dollars that enabled the genocide in Gaza. So this is very important, but it didn't come out of nowhere. The fact that so many people were able to show up in massive actions of civil disobedience, if it's in front of Wall Street, because it was asking the questions of who profits from genocide and occupation, in Congress, or shutting down business as usual in Grand Central Station in New York, calling for ceasefire, and all along using the Jewish discourse, reclaiming how Jewish meanings and symbols and narratives are deployed to justify acts of violence. In the same way, for instance, as now many Jewish people mobilize against Project Esther that we spoke about earlier, which is a cultural appropriation of the story of Esther in order to mount an assault against DEI and so forth. I wasn't surprised that there has been still so much Jewish representation in Palestine solidarity, and also calls just mobilization for ceasefire and to stop American support for the violence. My understanding of the current moment and the current mobilization has really been grounded in my research for a book that I published in 2019. It's called Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians. It came out with the University of Chicago Press. And the work for this book involved a lot of ethnographic research with American Jews who are along a spectrum, both in terms of their upbringing, what kind of denominations they were incubated in, and also it's along a spectrum in terms of their level of activism and also in terms of their levels of approaches to Zionism. All my interlocutors for this book, for the book Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians, they are all people who became, over time, critical of the Israeli occupation. But this critique shifted, and even what we mean by occupation is something that can be interrogated and open to conversation, because some people start in 1967 when Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and this is the occupation, and some people go deeper into bringing that settler colonial frame and so forth to talk about the Nakba as a way of discussing the occupation. So for the book, I've really engaged ethnographically with mobilization and people who ask questions about the kind of stories that they were told at home with respect to what it means to be Jewish, and many, especially young, but not only, because there is a longer history of Jewish anti-Zionist sentiments that is not grounded in theology, that is grounded in other kind of sources. Jewish opposition to Zionism and Jewish opposition, especially to the military occupation of 1967. So there is a longer kind of history, but in the 2000s, and especially as you have those really massive cyclical assaults on Gaza, at each moment, like for instance in 2008 was a massive assault on Gaza, or in 2014, each time you have an increase of critical Jews, especially younger people, who are really having a hard time reconciling the kind of values that they're thinking about when they think of Jewish values, and then what is being done in their name. Israel as the Jewish state is doing in their name. So I've been tracing this process for a long time. One of the sociological questions is really understand what makes people change their affective loyalties? What kind of processes go into that? So I engage in really in-depth interviews with American Jewish activists or Palestine solidarity activists or people who question Zionism on different levels and in different places. I also joined actions, including actions in the West Bank where American Jews went in solidarity or understood their role also as co-resistance to the military occupation. Their understanding of solidarity was to take directives from Palestinian actors on the ground. And so I joined those actions and observed what unfolded. And so this is just to say that my familiarity with the movement that was building for a long time, represented by groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, is a reference to one of the three questions of the ancient Rabbi Hillel, who famously said the Torah is basically can be contained in three questions. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, who am I? And the third question, which really contains the urgency, if not now, when? Which is the name that a movement that started in 2014, exactly at the moment of one of the other assaults on Gaza that I mentioned earlier, led by college graduates. This is the name that they chose for themselves. The Jewish mobilization in the American context was especially about interrogating the elders, interrogating Jewish institutions, the Jewish establishment, for often using Jewish vocabulary, Jewish repertoire in order to articulate the protest against a Jewish establishment that includes the Jewish federations, Zionist lobbies, what kind of narrative they tell about Jewish history. You see this Jewish mobilization trying to retrieve different kind of narratives about Jewish identity, Jewish meaning, Jewish history, in order to challenge the Jewish establishments and its unquestioning support of a political project. So it really opened the space for interrogating that conflation of Jewishness with a political project, which is a very important conversation. So my findings for the book, that I really can see it manifesting now in observing the kind of Jewish mobilization that we see in relation to the assault on Gaza, the ethnic cleansing, and also, of course, we see it all boomeranging, coming back to the United States with people, Jewish and non-Jewish, and of course the most vulnerable people are Palestinian in the United States on university campuses. But it comes to that absurdity that we talked about in reference to Project Esther, where it says explicitly in the document that if you are Jewish and you are not defending Israel, then you are not really Jewish. And this is also backed by the kind of rhetoric that you hear from Trump and his network. So my finding from the book is that the movement of Jews, again, associated with groups like If Not Now, Jewish Voice for Peace, but also in the current moment we have Rabbis for Ceasefire and a host of other organizations. And so I looked at it in the book as a movement, and really we see it in the current moment as a movement that allies itself with other movements for justice. This really connects to my finding from the book, which is the movement is intersectional, the analysis is intersectional, the intersectionality of all struggles, and that Jews will not be safe until Palestinians are safe, which is like one of the slogans. But also the movement is very relational in the sense that Jewish people in the movement are confronted directly through their relationality with what they owe Palestinians. So it's relational in this respect. It leads to reflection and reassessment of what it means to be Jewish now in the context of Jewish domination, Jewish power, and especially now in the context of genocide. I should also add that there is also a mobilization of Jews in the context of Palestine Israel that involves a lot of reflection on Zionism and Jewish history and what it means and how it's weaponized and so forth.
You are a professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies. Can you share with us what you teach your students?
I teach at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm primarily located in the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, which is an interdisciplinary space. And the Peace Institute defines itself as a space to teach students and for research, of course, on the causes of violence, the causes of conflicts, and violence in all its forms. We would add over the years that it also includes epistemic forms of violence, structural, cultural, symbolic, and direct forms of violence. We have created a space for the study and interrogation of the causes of violence and conflict, and also thinking of pathways and sources for peace building, for conflict transformation. I teach some general courses like Introduction to Peace Studies. Of course, I bring to the foreground very much the case of Palestine Israel, but in order to exemplify some of those issues with respect to how can we understand violence, how an expansive understanding of violence also illuminates complex understanding of peace building, and especially for me, because I come from religious studies, especially religion, ethics, and politics, so that intersection, to think in complex ways about how religion plays out, both in violence and potentially in conflict transformation. So I teach kind of basic classes on Introduction to Peace Studies for undergraduate, but also recently, I taught the second-year cohort of PhD students. There are peace studies, and then they're also grounded in a different discipline like theology, political science, sociology, history. I introduce them to some key texts and ways of thinking about decoloniality and how does it challenge conceptions of peace and justice. But then I also teach very specific electives, courses on Palestine Israel. And in recent years, one of the courses that I've been teaching most frequently, and I really love, is called Palestine Israel through film. I love it because it very quickly helps the student understand the importance of lenses and representation and framing, asking questions, who is in the frame, who is inside the lens, who is outside the lens. And so very quickly it illuminates for the students the basic theories of Edward Said, for instance, and Orientalism, and brings to the surface the questions about epistemology, epistemic violence. Some of the films are so good and so compelling and really bring the students into the space, into the smells and sounds and just personal human stories. So I've been really enjoying teaching that class, Palestine Israel through film.
Your most recent book is entitled Decolonizing Religion and Peace Building. You argued a liberal approach to interreligious dialogue is not always helpful. Can you elaborate on this?
So the book, Decolonizing Religion and Peace Building, funnily enough, it was my effort to get out of the Palestine-Israel space. And I looked at 2 case studies in the Philippines and Kenya. But the main question that was driving the research for the book, and it also involved ethnographic and sociological methods like focus group discussions. And I met with many people in both spaces in what I call in the book peace-building industry projects, especially interreligious peace-building projects, which really illuminates one of the things that I trace in the book is the intersection between peace-building projects that are increasingly, especially after September 11th, 2001, has focused on religious literacy and interreligious work and examine how it operates within a securitizing discourse. So it's very important to bring to the foreground interrogation of Islamophobia and the war on terrorism, which is global. And also I looked at how the security discourse intersects with neoliberalism and with a development frame. So part of it is reflected in the United Nations Development Goals, the 17 Development Goals. Goal 16 and Goal 17 are all about basically the intersection or the de-siloing of the development policy with the peace-building policies that often were like operating in different framework. But part of why they were synergized, which is a very neoliberal term, cannot be understood without also understanding the securitizing discourse of the counterterrorism and how it operates through a very reductive and simplistic understanding of religion as either, in the context of counterterrorism, of course, religion is a marked category. Again, this reflects the Islamophobic and Orientalist dimensions, especially after September 11th. You need to contain bad religion, but then gradually there was an understanding that, we also need to cultivate or mobilize good religion. And there you have this massive investment through a variety of kind of granting agencies, governmental, intergovernmental spaces, various donor countries, all of a sudden investing in various projects of interreligious but also intra-religious activities, and also development projects that are also referred to as livelihood projects, with an understanding like a theory of change that understands that, if only people will not be so fatalistic. We'll have something to live for. We'll have food a little bit. We'll have conditions for survivability. They will not do something that is destructive and will keep the peace. This is where peace is not the same as justice, of course. It's not the same as addressing or redressing the long histories of colonialism in both those contexts, in Kenya and in the Philippines and Mindanao, where I focused the most. And so I looked at that industry of religion and peace building, and traced how some of the conclusions that emerge from the cases. And also, in many respects, it does reflect back to Palestine Israel, because this is another context where you had massive investment now for decades in people-to-people engagement and really very reductive deployment of religion, as if the issue is religious. It's not to say that there are no religious dimensions, but this is where it is really important to understand intersectionally, politically, contextually, how precisely religion participates in the formation of violence. Because as I said before, you can understand Palestine Israel without understanding the dynamics of settler colonialism, without understanding the imperial histories, without understanding the role of the British and their imperial agenda in Palestine. You can understand the current moment without understanding American agenda in the region. And so to simply reduce thinking about a particular conflict in terms of religion, which is very much ingrained in liberal framing of interfaith engagement, one becomes very decontextualized. It has the effect of depoliticizing religion and the discussion. So those are some of the reflections that emerge from looking at the two cases where I really engage very deeply with how specifically religion is deployed in ways that both very reductively reduce people to their religious identities, and on that basis they negotiate their common good, which of course this is a very colonial move of defining people, using religion as a taxonomy of empire. And then it becomes a mechanism, also a tool for peace building, which itself serves a security neoliberal global discourse that brings to the foreground the fact that peace engagement is not the same, really getting to questions of justice, affirmative action, of reparation, and so forth. So the point is, also as a scholar of religion, someone who's been interested all my career and my personal life in my own autobiographical journey, in really understanding how religion in complex way connects to the formation of political, sociological, cultural identities, discourses, to understanding that through a critique that historicizes, that understand, for instance, Jewish Zionism came after Christian Zionism. And many scholars look at Jewish Zionism as a form of the colonization of Jewish consciousness by Christian imagination about the Jews, about the Holy Land. So you have to engage in historical and historicist critique. But of course, critique is not enough, because it's also a form of privilege to just be on the level of critique. So a through line in all my thinking, all my career, is this notion of the critical caretaking. So critique is very important in order to really to interrogate, to understand how certain ideas were formed, where is the power, really engage in a very specific analysis of power. And identities don't just descend from nowhere, understand the sociological and political formation. And critique is absolutely necessary, but then one needs to also move into the caretaking, the constructive. And this is where it's hermeneutical, interpretive. This is how, to go back to the other case of American Jews that we spoke about earlier, for the American Jews that I engaged for my book, Days of Awe, they were confronted by a realization, occupation, the military occupation that they saw in the West Bank. When they go in their actions of civil disobedience, they say on their T-shirts, occupation is not my Judaism. But then they also need to think constructively, what is my Judaism? And then you see processes of retrieval of different histories, different narratives, different reclaiming of, for instance, of the meanings of the holidays, from Zionist interpretation of the holidays, and also thinking very historically of what does it mean to be Jewish now in terms of my responsibility to Palestinians. So this critical caretaking is very different than the logic of peace building that essentializes what the religious traditions are about. What does Judaism mean? What does Islam mean? Because a lot of the peace building work that instrumentalize religion is exactly that. It's utilitarian. It comes with the question, what can religion do for me? How can I use religion? How can I use so-called religious actors to advance X agenda or Y agenda? And that agenda always has to be measurable because we are in a neoliberal space, that everything has to be coded. So this is where the kind of the critique comes from. And with the conclusion with the book that actually it's an ironic conclusion that more emphasis on religion actually means less religious knowledge and complex knowledge of religion. It's utilitarian. It mostly mobilizes heteronormative interpretations of the tradition as well.
Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon and for such a rich conversation. Thank you also for your scholarship and work. If you like this episode, please click comment and subscribe so that more people will know about this podcast. Thank you.